I'm delighted to introduce our final speaker of the afternoon, Professor Peter Edge from Oxford Brookes University. Professor Edge is an expert in the law of small jurisdictions, including the Isle of Man, and he's published widely in this area. In fact, his work on Manx public law is currently available online to download for free, which is excellent news. I'm absolutely delighted that he's here this afternoon to offer us an Imperial perspective on 1867.
It's always hard being the last speaker in a day with such great papers. And how do I follow the constitutional enormity, which was the previous paper? What I'm going to do is take a look at 1867 in a particular way, sort of tone down some of the celebratory aspects that's easy for us to tell ourselves, identify something I think has been neglected in constitutional reforms of 1865 to 1867, and then finish by asking, should we be here? Is this something to celebrate today? I have one Brexit and a Trump in my paper. I'll get the Brexit out of the way. If there's anything I'm learning from Brexit, there's many things I'm learning from Brexit, if there's anything I'm learning, it's that nations are the stories they tell themselves. And those stories are constantly changing. And if you think of the Manx story, 1765 is a low point. Okay, we came very, very close in lots of ways to losing the distinctive national identity and the legal identity of the Isle of Man. We survived that, we weathered that, and 1867 is another point in our national story where we naturally want to be upbeat. There is good news to tell, ourselves and the world more generally. Part of our celebration, power to the Isle of Man. Increased autonomy, increased power moving into the Isle of Man after really a tremendous trough from 1765. And the shift from an oligarchy, a self-perpetuating little group of elite, who didn't even all go to Eton, a self-perpetuating elite in the Keys, who then becomes an elected body. I'm going to talk about how far we should be celebrating both of those, and then deal with this neglected element of the reforms, which is actually around the jury role of the House of Keys. And I'm doing all of this from a particular perspective, which is looking at taking the idea that the reforms, especially in the 19th century, were partnerships. The UK had to be a partner in these reforms. The UK would have had its own agenda and its own input into this. And again, second lesson from Brexit, if you're negotiating serious constitutional reforms with somebody, they might have their own agenda as well. So, what's the UK agenda? The UK was becoming the centre of a global empire. And if we just quickly look at the imperial map, 1713, 1850, 1914. Okay? And I think just the scale of that expansion speaks for itself. And so you had a situation where London, the imperial hub, was governing a vast array of different territories and different cultures. And Belgium has said that in the 19th century we see that increasingly driven by a limited convenience and ideological imperative, successive British governments displayed decreasing tolerance for anomalies, deviations and inconsistencies from fiscal, constitutional and other norms. So as Britain develops an empire with a certain number of templates that it shoves onto those territories, the temptation to try and have the Isle of Man fit into those templates becomes stronger and stronger. So, these celebrations. First one, the increase in practical power in the Isle of Man. There was an idea floating around the empire, in around the time we're focusing on, of responsible government. And Lord Durham is generally credited with championing this idea. And he argued that when you look at territories such as Canada, you want the imperial governor to be exercising less power, and power to be shifting towards a cabinet-style government responsible to the National Assembly of the territory. Okay? And the shorthand for that throughout the imperial period was responsible government, and whether a particular territory is ready for responsible government. Canada developed in 1848, New Zealand and most of the Australian states by 1859. So this was an idea that was floating around in the period we're interested in, around about 1865. It was rejected for the Isle of Man. So you have a situation where the reform of the Keys is giving you a democratically elected assembly, but it doesn't follow the responsible government goes. It was found the Isle of Man was actually too small for responsible government. It wouldn't be able to get the necessary skills to govern itself. Despite the lack of responsible government, there was a prescient fear from Lieutenant Governor Hope, who is depicted here. In 1853, while resisting some of the earlier calls for democratisation, he argued that the democratic keys would claim far greater and more arbitrary power at issue with the British government and any council consisting of members nominated by the Crown. I mean, he was obviously wrong about this. Clash between keys and council evaporated around about 1880. So, he's arguing that once you give democratic legitimacy to the keys, you're going to be fighting, you're going to be facing constitutional crises between the democratically elected keys, the imperial government, which we have no say over, and the council, which at the time he was writing, consisted of Crown appointees. So, yes, power came into the Isle of Man as part of the 1865 reforms, but it didn't necessarily go to what you might think of as the indigenous Manx parts of the Constitution. It actually was largely vested in the Lieutenant Governor, with the qualifications we talked about. And as we've already had briefly referred to, the Lieutenant Governor stayed incredibly powerful, incredibly long. And a lot of the Manx story from the late 19th and 20th centuries is about the gradual erosion of the power of the Lieutenant Governor. Certainly in the 19th century, Walpole remarked that power in the Isle of Man was largely concentrated in the Governor, and no one has really disagreed with that. So, yes, power is coming into the Isle of Man, it's not coming to the Manx. Second part of our story, the democratisation of the keys. From 1659 at the latest, and there is some argument saying it was a little bit before that, the House of Keys had a central role in its own membership. They would nominate two names to the Governor, and the Governor would choose one. The expectation was that the Governor would choose the first name given to them. Okay? So, they would decide who their own membership was. And a lot of it became bound around families and affinities and existing alliances. It wasn't completely solid. We see instances of members of the Keys being dismissed by the Governor as late as 1731, so there was a slight precariousness about it for some of the period. But I think that on the verge of 1865, Moore's quite right. He said the Keys became more and more a closed corporation, and membership was largely confined to a few leading families. Now, the imperial models aren't all pointing in the same direction. You did have unelected assemblies in some parts of the empire. Hong Kong had an assembly in 1843, unelected, all appointed. India in 1861, all appointed. Dominica had a completely elected assembly, and then in 1865, interesting coincidence of dates there, in 1865, the wholly elected assembly became half elected, half appointed. So they actually moved the other direction from us. Would anyone like to hazard a guess as to what these territories have in common from the imperial perspective of the mid-19th century?
Money generation.
Possibly.
They're not white.
They're not white. Okay? They are not ethnically European. You look at the ethnically European colony territories, however, the settler colonies, as they're often described. Canada, 1841, elected assembly. New Zealand, 1853, elected assembly. Okay? So there are models, and in what feels to me like a racist model within the British Empire, the Isle of Man would have fallen into the ethnically European. Okay? However you constructed the racism, the Isle of Man would have been on that side of it. What you didn't have, anywhere that I could find, is a situation where there is an assembly and it is a self-perpetuating caste. It's not officially appointed, it's not elected, it appoints it from itself, from a limited number of families connected by business, affinity, culture. And Robert Peel described it as so anomalous a body as could not exist within the British Empire. So, we did have a very strange House of Keys at this point. Once UK attention is focused on the House of Keys, once it becomes a matter of actual interest, as it does in the mid-19th century, there's a certain amount of head scratching. You do what? Well, that doesn't look like anything like we're used to. So, there's a big change. There is democratisation of the keys. The franchise, I have realised from today that giving any numerical information about the franchise in 1867 was wildly overambitious. From Commode, I got franchise limited to around 20% of the adult population. Okay? Commode argued it was a narrower franchise, substantially narrower than the English equivalent. He also thinks that a tiny proportion of the adult male population were allowed to contest elections. So the eligibility to be an MHK was narrower than the equivalent would be in England. And the result of this small franchise, which, as the earlier speakers already said, excluded women, was a thoroughly conservative House. 13 of the 24 members elected having sat in the old self-elected House, and a majority of the 11 new men being pledged to conservative views. The House in 1867 is more democratic than the House that preceded it. It's more democratic than the democracies of classical Greece, when we talk about them. We didn't have slaves who were unable to vote. Women couldn't vote in either. They were not completely inclusive democracies in the way we would recognise today. But they were on the way. So they're two things that we would typically think of to celebrate today. I want to touch on a third major change in the Manx situation, which was the demise of a very, very Manx institution. Dr. Feiss has already mentioned the fact that the House of Keys got itself in some serious trouble by blurring of the legislative and the judicial roles just before democratisation. The Isle of Man had a very well-established scene where the House of Keys, this self-appointed, perpetual standing body, was the ultimate jury. In the Court of General Jail Delivery, the criminal court where all the most serious cases were heard, they would sit in every trial, and they would be punished if the Keys refused to present themselves to a felony trial. They were not there to try the defendant, they were there to stare at the jury for the entire proceedings and to punish the jury if they acted inappropriately. Okay, and perhaps more frightening for attorneys general, they also, in the early part of the period, would punish the prosecutor if they thought the prosecutor wasn't being sincere enough in what they were doing. Okay, so you have the Keys sat in the ultimate criminal court of the Isle of Man, enforcing norms, regulating, controlling the jury. And as Clark said in 1817, they were there to observe whether the jury digressed from the evidence by giving a false and partial verdict, in which case they are liable to be severely fined and punished. They also were meant to be there to advise the Deemsters on Manx customary law. Think of the original Tynwald when it wasn't sort of so bifurcated. The Deemsters might say, "Oh, we think the customary punishment is this, but we're not quite sure." There's two Deemsters, they can disagree. The two Deemsters disagree. They can call the Keys, who are meant to be this repository of customary legal knowledge, and they can advise them. By the early 19th century, this is starting to look a bit creaky. And the governor, who, as we've already seen, was not a governor who was favourably disposed towards the Keys, was very upset with the House of Keys being in all of the felony trials. And he complained to Westminster saying, look, they are slowing everything down. They aren't just sitting quietly in the corner at the end of the trial and then punishing a jury. They're getting involved in the whole process. It's all taking forever. And so between them, they generated a test case, which reached the Privy Council as Kelly in 1824. They excluded the Keys from the Court of General Jail Delivery and then convicted a 14-year-old boy of burglary and sentenced him to death. He appealed. He appealed on the basis that his indictment was dodgy. One of the Deemsters thought his indictment was dodgy. One of them thought it was okay. Because there were two Deemsters, they locked and the indictment was found to be valid. His argument was, if the Keys had been there, the Keys could have been involved as well and would have been resolved. The Keys joined the case, saying that excluding them from the criminal trial was a violation of the fundamental liberties of the Manx. They lost. Kelly, Privy Council, the Keys go out to the Court of General Jail Delivery. Okay? So, already busy members of the House of Keys will be glad they don't have to go to every General Jail Delivery. Thank Kelly. However, they stayed there for civil cases. You would have a civil case in front of a Manx jury, they would give a verdict, you could then appeal to the House of Keys, who would sit as another jury. There were certain rules of evidence about what they could do, but you could basically appeal to them. And, for instance, in Moore and Stowell, 1830, so quite late, they reversed the dismissal of a civil suit for assault and awarded £100 of damages. So this chap had defended his accusation of assault, it had been appealed to the House of Keys, the House of Keys had found him liable for assault, and given damages of £100, very substantial sum for the period. We might think it's a bit weird that the House of Keys wasn't elected, But from the imperial perspective, to have a non-elected, standing permanent body able to overturn every civil jury case that reached it, having recently been involved in every criminal trial, was very strange indeed. I would like to illustrate this with the person I will now think of as the Manx Donald Trump, G.W. Dumbbell. The House of Keys was a fantastic place to do business. Okay, if you look at the business interests of members of the House of Keys, and especially the legal interests of many members of the House of Keys, this is a powerhouse. Dumble was counsel for the appellant in a libel trial against the Manx son, and they only got 40 shillings. So his client appealed to the House of Keys. He stopped being the counsel for his client, walked into the House of Keys, and unsurprisingly, they raised it to £100. Okay? So the same person who was being paid to represent his client then sits in the jury that decides whether to reverse the jury that only gave him 40 shillings. The Keys argued that this meant they couldn't be elected. It would be monstrous to have people who were elected exercising this role. The British government response was, well, we could always get rid of the role. And lo and behold, in 1865, they shoved the Keys out of the civil jury appeal system that they used to have. They didn't actually replace it for a year. So for a year there was no appeals process. And then they sort of scrambled to fix it and they introduced the 1866 Civil Appeals Act. So, should we be celebrating 1867? I think we should. I think we need to recognise that the Manx Constitution is not about revolution. We had a chance for revolution in 1765. It would have been absolutely dreadful. We would now be sat here as part of Cumberland, discussing the wonderful evolution of Cumberland as a district council. Okay? That was our revolutionary moment. It didn't happen. Instead, as Walpole says, the Constitution of the Isle of Man, like the Constitution of the United Kingdom, is no rigid law. It has never been embodied in any document or regulated by any statute. It has changed, it is changing, it is susceptible of future change. From that perspective, 1867 was the crucial beginning of several journeys. I think the removal of the Keys from the judicial process was absolutely essential to the development of the Isle of Man later on. One of the big selling points of the British Isles, the British Islands, for international legal business, is judicial impartiality. Okay? You can trade on the fact that your courts are fair. It actually gives you a competitive advantage against other countries. I think if we had a situation where a jury trial could be overturned by members of the House of Keys who were elected, that would not have developed as a competitive advantage. It would be seen as too obvious to screw some political spin into that. It was also the start of opening up the franchise. We've already had mentioned the mutual hatred between ourselves and New Zealand contesting over this. Who was there first? And we've already had some suggestions that may actually be neither of us were there first, which would settle things down. What I think I could happily say, even if everyone here was from New Zealand, is this tiny gap between male and female suffrage. We have a gap of 15 years from when some men could vote to when some women could vote. And that's not the case in New Zealand. Because remember, New Zealand had elected assembly well before we did. Okay, so I think we've definitely got the Kiwis on this one. And the third thing is that the legitimacy given to the Keys, as Lieutenant Governor Hope feared, has led to an increasing shift towards responsible government. It was a very, very long story, a surprisingly long story, but eventually it did result in responsible government in the Isle of Man in the form we recognise it today. So, there is cause to celebrate. 1867 was a very important historical moment in the Isle of Man. I actually think we're going to have more to celebrate in 1881. There are certain people in the UK constitutional scene who sort of think the Isle of Man is, the clocks go back to 1950. And so it's quite nice to say, when did you let women vote? Oh, 1881 for us, actually, thank you very much. And 16-year-olds, when did they vote in national elections? Oh, okay. So I think 1881 will be even bigger, but this is worth celebrating. But I think it is worth recognising that the Constitution of 1867 was less Manx than the Constitution of 1800. It looked much closer to the imperial norms that were being applied elsewhere. The self-perpetuating elite that was the House of Keys couldn't find it anywhere else. The House of Keys sitting in appeal on jury trials Couldn't find it anywhere else, okay? So after 1865, the constitution we have is better. I think I can say that fairly categorically. It also looks more like what London is used to doing. So the officials who govern this increasing global empire are working with the Manx structures which look more like what they're applying everywhere else. And that, I think, is how it fits into the Imperial Perspective. Thank you very much.
We have a couple of minutes for some questions.
Oh yes, can I ask, what happened to the boy? Was he? Yes.
Astonishing. Quite often lawyers will not be able to tell you the answer. You know, or we can normally say, oh, they're convicted, and that we lose interest at that point. However, I happen to know that his conviction was taken down from execution to transportation. So he didn't die. I do wonder if they had chosen a 14-year-old burglar rather than any of the other old lags who were being done that year as a way of sort of making it a more attractive test case. What I think is quite interesting is that the Lieutenant Governor tried to resist Kelly being taken as a test case. Because basically Whitehall said, look, leak to the House of Keys that they can have an appeal to the Privy Council, make this happen so we get a definitive ruling. And he was saying, oh, don't feed him, ignore the troll.
I've got two lawyers in the room, so I'm going to get at least three opinions. Obviously, one of the big build-ups to the election, popular election of the House of Keys, was Brown going to prison, and the House of Keys relying on its powers to put somebody in prison. Should any errant newspaper editor be listening, do you think that's a power that we could still exercise today, and if not, where do you think it got lost?
Gosh. I don't know the answer to contempt of legislative body, because basically they had the power to punish for contempt as a legislature, and they cocked up, they did these in the wrong way. I think Manx newspaper editors might have more to fear from section 335 of the Criminal Code.
Spreading false news.
Spreading false news, yeah, which I'm trying to make it more verbal saying it's
As I know, the 1876 Criminal Proceedings Act clarified that situation, and journalists could be hauled up for contempt and fined and imprisoned.
1876, was make a note of that.
I was hauled up in 1870.
You're putting yourself in Tidwell balls.
I was hauled up in 1986 before Tidwell and cross-questioned and threatened by Governor New that I would be in contempt if I didn't answer the questions. The Keys, Tidwell clarified that after the James Brown incident to make sure that they weren't going to be humiliated again.
There you go. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm thinking back to my childhood and trying to remember what we did in 1967 when this was 100 years instead of 150. Are we making more out of 150 than we did out of 100? And if so, what does that say about us or our take on what happened in 1867? Any suggestions?
I've noticed it's increasingly easy to hang things on date tags. So when you see people publishing in historical journals, you will see them saying it's 100 years since so-and-so. 75 years, when did that become a day we celebrate? So I think maybe there is something perhaps about our fluid modernity, which means we want to lock ourselves more tightly into the past. I also think that since the 1960s, the Isle of Man has become more celebratory of its culture and its past. There is a quote which still stays with me from an MHK in 1964. They were debating particular wordings of an Act of Tynwald. And he said, as far as I'm concerned, it is our duty to respectfully copy the wordings of an Act of Parliament. So he was seeing the role of the Manx organs as being, doffing of the cap and respectful to the much better informed and accurate UK ones. And I think things have transformed in my lifetime in relation to the celebration of Manx culture and Manx history.
Just the biggest thing that happened in 1966 was actually the House of Keys was gifted a new Speaker's robe, which we're still using
By the British government.
by the Speaker of the House of Commons. And, yeah.
Was it a new robe or second hand?
It's new then, it's wearing it.
Yeah, a lot wearing it.
Question.
Well, what I just find on that really, I suspect, thinking back again,
part of the problem was the 1860s also a bit of an embarrassment. Because when you think about it, there was always this great big thing about how long we've had Parliament, how long we've long tradition. The fact that it was only been elected 100 years previously, and before that it was a bunch of self-elected mates. That's not necessarily something you want to advertise.
Yeah, and I think also, I mean, I have a colleague at Brookes who specialises in commemoration and the way that different cultures do that. And I think perhaps 1979 when we look back at a turning point for the Manx celebrate things, because the millennium really was a huge event, I think, and that sort of created a current place.
False news, that was.
And we certainly can argue whether 979 makes any sense, yeah.
But of course, this Hobsbawm were all very aware of the invention of tradition anyway.
Yeah.
Just come back to some remarks you made earlier about people or nations developing views of themselves, and they may embroider from time to time. And is it possible? I mean, that's happening in Europe. In the UK, the various anniversaries, the song, almost every year. It's almost like doing a sort of contemporary history, or how we should view the past from today, and rewriting even our own histories. And maybe we're getting better at it, isn't it?
I think that's definitely true. I think every culture writes its own, every moment writes its own history of particular moments. So the history we write of 1865 is not the history that we'll be writing in 100 years' time, for instance. Lawyers do it particularly badly because we love having this idea that it's always been the case. So you have a lawyer who suddenly turns everything up on its head and they say, well, obviously this has been the case since 1830, and they blink. So the way in which elites use history is interesting as well, but I think it is seen as very important to creating a national and ethnic identity, and that creation will change from period to period. As we had earlier mentioned about the fact that Manx nationalism was completely silent in 1867.
Well, just in a way, by example, we went to see Viceroy's house the other night, and I think that those Brits that know about the independence of India and what have you still probably have if anything, that the Brits were doing their best by the Indians and it all turned out to be a muddle. Actually, it was probably a fairly fair film, but it did show there was a dark side to it, and from the British point of view, and which was sort of interesting because maybe the Britons had been told a slightly more uplifting tale of the retreat from empire than in fact is the actual case.
Well, and you do find Indian legal scholars who don't talk about the Raj, they talk about the occupation consistently as the entire period, which is itself a political act rather than necessarily entirely neutral.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.